Good afternoon. We want to say welcome to everyone who is
Recording in
watching
progress.
and to whoever will listen later or watch later. So another event of our Observatory of Foreign Policy and Brazil's international insertion, which is a project of the Federal University of the ABC in the International Relations Department and with the support of FES Brazil. So this particular event is part of the working group on trade policy, international trade policy, with the support of FES Brazil. On the 28th of June 2019, after more than 20 years of negotiations with several interruptions, ministers from the Mercosur and EU commissioners announced the conclusion of the commercial part of the association agreement between the EU and the Mercosur. We have only partial access to it, and it's being reviewed judicially, legally, undergoing a legal review and also translations. So we are concerned about the deepening asymmetries between the blocs, and different European parliaments have held off on ratification, particularly with regard to the environmental policies of the Bolsonaro government in Brazil. So our discussions will center mostly on the agreement with this question, how's it going? So we have planned initial 2 20-minute participations, interventions, one from Professor Armando Mineiro and Rebrip advisor, PhD candidate from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who will make an introductory remarks about the agreement, the association agreement, EU-Mercosur. Later, I'll hand over the floor to Professor Markus Krajewski, who is a public law and international law professor of Erlangen-Nürnberg University. Professor Markus's research centers on European foreign relations, human rights, public services. So the two remarks will be followed by comments, remarks from Professor Giorgio Romano, who is a professor of the UFABC, an associate professor of the International Relations course, and also of the Global Political Economy master's program, and of the bachelor's program in economic science. So I thank all of our speakers for accepting our invitation and Professor Giorgio's remarks, comments. So I hand over to Professor Adhemar Mineiro. Adhemar, thank you for being here. The floor is yours. 20 minutes. Hello, thank you, Lucas. Thank you for the invitation for the ABC International Relations crowd. Thank you for being here for this debate. Also, thank you for being here with Professor Markus Krajewski, who is with us in spite of the fact that it's already the evening in Germany. So it's much later there. So he is taking part. It's a proof of his resistance at this point. Thank you to the FES people who made this possible. Well, the agreement, Mercosur EU, as Professor Lucas has already mentioned, was concluded in June 2019. In other words, it was a process that lasted more than 20 years, These negotiations began in the mid-90s, mid-1990s, around the same time of the ALCA negotiations, the FTAA, and around the time of the formation of the WTO. So this is the conjuncture, the setting where the agreement started to be stitched together. It forecasts three basic pillars: a political dialogue, a free trade agreement, and a cooperation agreement. From the beginning, the emphasis was always on the free trade agreement. Permanently, when negotiators, especially on the Mercosur side, but this was also good for the European discourse, was that, when we conclude the free trade agreement, the others will follow along naturally. So the process of negotiation was always a negotiation geared more to trade, to free trade. However, when it was concluded in a setting of the end of the Trump government, towards the end of the Trump government, and was very hostile. The environment was very hostile. So the negotiation processes, like the TPP, the transatlantic partnership, the trans-Pacific partnership, the TISA agreement on services, were all hindered by the US position that withdrew from some of these processes or froze others. So the environment in which the agreement was concluded emphasized the fact that this would be the major agreement. There was this whole political discourse around it, in the sense that this agreement, if concluded, would give a new lease of life to trade negotiations and an extra impulse. So the WTO, for instance, was sort of in intensive care at that time. And so a successful conclusion of this dialogue would reactivate the WTO, for instance. So the agreement, Mercosur-EU, the end of the process of negotiation took place in an environment that was very different from that of when it began. So this justifies, or ends up justifying, the fact that in this process of negotiation, as I said, you have three pillars being negotiated. One of them was a political dialogue. There was a lot of emphasis on the democratic process, the defense of democracy, and you ended up concluding the negotiations in a setting where democracy in our region, in Latin America, particularly South America, was being challenged. So in Brazil, there was a lot of discussion regarding the institutional rupture that happened in 2016, whether the government then, and with a subsequent election of a president that never defends democracy, whether there would be legitimacy to conclude a chapter on political dialogue based on the defense of democracy with governments that are far from being advocates for democracy. So the Argentinian process in 2017, at the meeting, the ministerial meeting of the WTO in Buenos Aires, many of us were there, Lucas was there. The difficulty for activists to enter even being officially registered, the difficulty we had to enter the country, to enter Argentina. So the Argentinian government was far from being an advocate, a true advocate of the democratic process. European activists were sent back, in fact. One European activist was sent back to a country, as well as an Ecuadorian sister, who was sent home, was not allowed to enter the country. So the setting is a setting where you have governments from the economic point of view that are, let's say, liberal, radically liberal from the economic point of view, but where the espousal of democracy was not a given, which of course meant there were contradictions with the negotiation process, where you had in the political dialogue chapter a strong chapter on the defense of democracy. And with regards to the economic, more strictly speaking, economic question, what is at the root of the agreement, in fact, is a neo-colonial pact. What is a neo-colonial pact? You go back to reinforcing the role of South American countries as exporters of primary products, agricultural commodities, ores, energy commodities, in return for opening markets fundamentally for greater value-added products of industrial nature, and also with the opening of the services market, government purchases, which were not part of the beginning of the negotiations, but after 2004 ended up entering the negotiation process. These negotiations were stopped around 2004, 2005. They came back, they were reactivated based on something President Lula said at the Ibero-American summit in 2011 in Spain. And then the government purchases entered the agenda. It's not part of the original framework of negotiation. It was introduced to try to close the agreement back in 2004, when there was an important eye to purchasing, and there was a time when Petrobras was really taking off, and so this question was put on the agenda to try to open up more space. So that wasn't possible in 2010 either. And after that, this chapter was on the table. So you offer government purchases, government procurement, and institutional safety for European investors in the chapters on investments and intellectual property. So basically, you're relaunching, in a way, the colonial pact based on these offers that are made and that consolidate an outlook about what should be the insertion of these South American countries, Mercosur as a bloc, into the international space. So I think that's an important point. And why is that? Firstly, because this discussion about the insertion of primary products in the international and the European market was always put on the agenda. So every time you had an expansion of markets in this field and growth of China in the international market, especially from the turn of the century, that was an important moment. So there was less pressure from the Mercosur business elites to advance in other processes of negotiation, whether ALCA in the beginning, later the discussion with the European Union, or even the discussions of the WTO. In other words, China for a long time was enough, quote unquote, so it could take out the pressure on the uh, local business elites, reduce the pressure to close other deals. So I think the role of China, I think, is very important for us to discuss probably in the debates later on. This is an important point, I think. So when the negotiations stop during the first decade of the century, this has to do very much with the opening of other areas for the region's international trade. And this may lead, but forgive me, as we saw with the relations with China and at the base of these agreements, the agreements reinforce, strengthen, by strengthening this colonial pact, this neo-colonial pact, what do? They also reinforce the sectors within these societies of Mercosur countries that are linked to these primary exporting sectors. So agricultural producers, mining companies, energy producers, basically oil. And this has two main effects over these societies. The first is that these sectors are the sectors that are most hostile to the environmental questions. So the pact reinforces within the societies of the Mercosur countries, regardless of any clause that you can put on the agreement trying to limit this damage, they reinforce, they strengthen the sectors that are most linked to the environmental degradation these regions, within these countries. So this is something that must be considered at the essence of the agreement, regardless of any pondering you can have regarding, side agreements, is a pressure, gigantic pressure in terms of environmental degradation, and that's at the heart of the agreement, in the essence of the agreement, in this neo-colonial pact.
The other issue has to do with developing these regions because these sectors connected to agribusiness, mining, and oil, these are very well, that they concentrate a lot of wealth and land in the country. So there's a lot of pressure in this process. So we have a concentration of wealth related to these agreements, and we also have a concentration of power. So owning wealth and land leads to concentrating power. So this kind of agreements, even if without agreements, the system that we may have with in the relation with China and other Asian countries, because the base of trade with other countries in the area like Korea and Japan, just like the EU and China, we always have this trade based on exporting primary products like in exchange of exporting value-added product. This is a little bit different if it comes to the United States and very different when it comes to the other countries that are the developing countries, but especially with EU and China and other big countries in Asia, the structure is very similar. So that it strengthens the tendency or the strength actually of concentrating income and wealth, and also this pressure on the environment and social sectors of these countries. So this kind of agreement works not for a structural change in the society in the Mercosur countries. And that's why actually the route to close negotiations is possible only by accelerating during Temer administration together with Macri administration in Argentina. The Temer was an administration that came after a rupture in Brazil, and then we have the Bolsonaro administration, authoritarian government. So these are administrations that are supported by the power that is connected to agribusiness, mining in these countries. So I think this is a crucial point for us to take into consideration. Talking about the society now, so I'm gonna try and close, wrap up. I think this is the critique that we have to this agreement. If you consider the first setup, this is an agreement where the chapter on trade is clearly in conflict with the political dialogue chapter because you're not strengthening the democracy in these countries. And then you have all the consequences on the environment. So it's no side agreement. It's no non-binding chapter that will solve this problem. So you're gonna have a lot of pressures. Actually, right now, the Bolsonaro administration is making changes while telling the Europeans that that will take into consideration um, environmental concerns by the European countries, but they want advance on land grabbing laws by strengthening the possibility uh, of strengthening these sectors. So this has always been around since the beginning of the agreement, this expectation. So that's why the agreement can be closed only in this political situation that's not really favorable and it's peculiar in the past years in this region. When it comes to society, again, so we would need actually this negotiation process to be resumed somehow. It is important that we don't consider negotiations closed yet because we need to reopen this process of negotiations. And the chapters on geopolitics and cooperations, they have to rule the agreement, and not the trade chapter should be ruling the agreement. So the political dialogue, the human rights, the social rights, environmental rights, these should be the drivers, and then based on that, you can then after that you can be talking about trade. I think last but not least that I should tell you is that in the past years, the agreement with the EU, just like with any other agreements, we have the conflict or the tension of the existence of Mercosur itself. Just like EU has been gone through two changes, and this hasn't been considered in the negotiations. One of the countries that was part of the negotiations in this process, they would also offer their market, which is the UK. They left the EU. So, and right now, Mercosur is threatened because we know there are tensions between the Brazilian government, Uruguay, and Argentina and Paraguay which is putting Mercosur at risk. And this is one element where Argentina has different positions compared to Brazil about this agreement. So this increases the tension in Mercosur, and this may actually contribute to the end of this block. So we should take this into consideration in our discussion because Mercosur it's at risk right now. It's being discussed right now. So there might be the possibility of not having Mercosur anymore. So that's it. I have only 20 minutes, so that's what I wanted to share before we start our discussion. But we can talk more about other points afterwards. So I'll hand it over. In the past, we would say we are in a round table, but now we are on the screen. So I'll hand it over to Marcus. Thank you. Thank you very much, Adhemar, for your introduction on the agreement and talking about trade and politics and the impact on the Mercosur and EU. I'll hand it over right away to Dr. Markus Krajewski so that we can have time for discussion at the end. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be with you. I'm very happy. Of course, it would be much nicer to see each other in presence, but I'm not sure whether, even if it would have been possible, I would have been able to just jump over and be with you. So this is one of the benefits of this new world and this new life, so that I can join you virtually. I have a small presentation which I am going to share now. And I hope you can all see it. So basically, I want to thank, of course, OPE and the FES for the invitation. And I think we already just heard a very thoughtful and thought-provoking, rich analysis by Professor Adhemar on the sort of political, economic, international political economic perspective. And my task is actually sort of more look into some of the legal questions, so I'm going to zoom into the agreement, the text of the agreement a little bit more. But of course, I want to frame that, situate that in this analysis that we've just heard, because I think many of the points that Professor Adhemar was making, I would certainly agree with. Now, my presentation is based on a study that was authored by a colleague of mine, Dr. Hoffman, and myself. And it was sponsored by a number of organizations, both development organizations and environmental organizations, and you can download it from the webpage of CITSE, just so you have the background of what I'm going to talk about. And basically, I want to just very briefly say something about the current status and structure, but we heard a lot about this already, so I don't think I need to go into the details. And then I will analyze the shortcomings. First, the shortcomings, predominantly the shortcomings of a particular chapter, the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, but I would also speak about some other parts of the agreement where I see shortcomings as well. And then I will sort of talk about some potential remedies. I think we will end up, or at least my proposal will be similar to what Professor Adhemar just told us. So very briefly, of course, we heard that in June 2019, the parties agreed in principle on this agreement. Now, I think it's important also from a political perspective that we realize that agreement in principle does not mean the agreement already exists or is set in stone. As a matter of fact, there are a number of political controversies in Europe, in the European Parliament, but there's also opposition by some European member states, notably Austria and France. But I want to point out, and I think that's important, and I'm sure many of you know this, but this opposition by these governments, and you may know that neither the Austrian government nor the French government are very progressive governments. This opposition is not due to the fact that they would perceive the agreement, as Professor Adhemar said, as sort of a neo-colonial pact, that they sort of reject this. No, they rather really are concerned only, so to speak, about some of the environmental and climate change implications. And I would also argue probably not even so much concerned about the rise of authoritarian government. So I think we should contextualize this opposition. There are, of course, strong forces in the European Parliament, Social Democrats, left, Green parties who are against the agreement as it stands right now. But there is also some opposition. So it's still not clear in the European Union where this is going. Now, what do we have? We have, and I think this is important, we have most of the chapters that will be the trade agreement that's been available since July 2019 officially, so we can analyze them. Just about, I think 3 weeks ago, the detailed schedules of concessions and of commitments were also made available. The political framework agreement, the agreement on sort of the dialogue, the institutional framework, but also human rights issues, has not officially been released, but there are some texts which have been leaked in October 2020. So we can assume that that's something we can base analysis. What's very important is the final text, the signature and ratification is still open. So even though the political narrative, at least the political narrative that the European Commission certainly wants to hear us, or at least us in Europe, is the agreement is done. We cannot reopen it. It's, you know, it's too late. But we have to realize that legally and politically, everything is still open, and everything can still be questions. There's nothing that is set in stone yet. So when it comes to the contents, and we've already heard this, I think it's important that this is an agreement which is predominantly following the, I want to call it classical WTO model, as Professor Adhemar mentioned. This is where it comes from. This is really the narrative. This is the structure. It talks about trade in goods. It talks about trade in services and establishment. Now we have to know, of course, that when these agreements talk about establishment, they mean investment liberalization. And I think this is very important. You may hear that the agreement does not contain investment protection. It doesn't contain ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, but it actually, I would argue from sort of a political economic perspective, it is much more dangerous that it contains this market opening element that Professor Adhemar was talking about. It's really about opening markets. Also the government procurement element, which is now part, is about opening markets. So I think we really have to, when we analyze this, we really have to understand that this is an agreement that aims, in the sort of classic neoliberal sense of the word, aims at opening markets for foreign investors and traders. It contains, of course, also a trade development chapter and state-to-state dispute settlement. Now, when it regards to the other chapters on the political agreement, we have sort of general provisions, institutions, and cooperations on human rights and democracy. And I really liked what Professor Adhemar said, that if we take it seriously, that these agreements should be about human rights, democracy, and so forth. Those are the chapters, or those are the provisions that should rule the trade chapters and not the other way around. So I thought that was a very, very thoughtful analysis. There's also the so-called essential elements clause in this agreement, and I'll come to that in just a moment. So let me look into the trade and sustainable development chapter. Now, this is really a chapter which is based on the model EU trade and sustainable development chapter. So this is very much a narrative that comes out of the European Commission, where they say, well, this is not a, this is the European touch to these free trade agreements, and they contain labor standards. It contains multilateral environmental agreements, climate change, biodiversity, sustainable management of forests and fisheries, but it does not refer to corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And I think that's very important, because that's now, I would say, an element which would really sort of partly at least counterbalance some of these market opening, giving more possibilities to investors and traders, but that's not in there. So we really have to say this is already sort of a first shortcoming, a first deficiency of this chapter. Now, when we look into what are the obligations in the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, we see it's basically on cooperation, on exchange of information. It confirms existing obligations, implements existing obligation. There are some very small elements that the parties should make their best endeavor to maybe increase their obligations, but it does not contain any new and independent obligations. So even though the chapter talks about the ILO core labor standards, talks about the Paris Climate Change Agreement, talks about all these other agreements, it really doesn't go beyond that. So, that also makes it very clear. It's a chapter not on sustainable development, it's a chapter on trade and sustainable development. I think we should realize that it's part of a trade agreement, so it really doesn't bring any progressive policy elements into this agreement in this context. And there's also sort of what I sometimes would call the favorite baby of the European Commission, the right to regulate clause, and the European Commission officials are very proud of this clause where they say, well, we put in this and the states retain the right to regulate. And so that's just not the problem. But of course, if you look into the clause itself, you realize it's not even worth the paper that it's written on. It basically just says states have the right to regulate. And I'm a public international lawyer, and I always find it puzzling that someone would put that into agreement, because of course states have the right to regulate. I mean, that's part of their sovereign power. So why would you put that into an agreement? Again, it doesn't really mean anything. And there is a special dispute settlement regime in the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, which basically takes the whole chapter out of the regular state-to-state dispute settlement. So that regular system is not applicable. There's a system where you have panel of experts. They can only formulate a recommendation. It's not a final legally binding decision. There are no sanctions. Now, I'm saying this because I think it again illustrates that from the perspective of the agreement, the sustainable development elements of the agreement are really sort of second-class obligations. If you have an agreement where you have a dispute settlement system, and then you say everything in the agreement is covered by the dispute settlement except this one part, and this one part is subject to another special regime which is of sort of lesser importance, you are also saying something about the other obligations. So I think, again, that's important to contextualize the relevance of trade, the relevance of sustainable development when it comes to the trade agreement. Very briefly on some other parts, because of course, now one could go very deeply into each chapter and talk about these elements at great length, but I just want to point a couple of things. The so-called essential elements clause only addresses human rights and democracy. It has nothing on climate change issues. There are some general exception clauses which do not specifically address human rights violations or climate change policies. So again, it's clear that if countries want to pursue progressive policies, progressive human rights policies, progressive climate change mitigation or combating policies, they will have difficulties defending them under this agreement. There's nothing specific on deforestation or energy transition. And here, and this is really echoes what Professor Adhemar said, the agreement sort of has a traditional focus on products, not on production methods, and it doesn't recognize any power asymmetries between the parties. So this is what you refer to as the neo-colonial pact. I think that it's really important to contextualize this agreement. It's I want to call it an old type agreement because it basically follows this logic of everything should be subject to the trade liberalization agenda. What can be done? Let me just discuss 3 remedies which have been part of the political debate, at least in Europe. I have to admit I haven't followed the debate in Brazil or in the other Mercosur countries, but one element of a remedy was, well, let's add a bilateral declaration. Let's just not touch the agreement, but just say in a bilateral declaration in which they both sides say, well, climate change is happening, is important, or what have you. So this instrument would be a declaration of both sides, the EU side and the Mercosur side, on specific aspects of the agreement, and it would typically be adopted at the time when the agreement is signed. And from a public international law perspective, such a declaration guides the interpretation of the agreement. So in law, we have the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which tells us how to interpret these agreements. And so this declaration could be seen as an instrument of interpretation. Now, that's very important. And I don't know how many lawyers are listening or how many people are here who have sort of specifically focused also on legal questions. But there's a substantial difference between interpreting an existing text and changing the text, obviously. I think that you don't have to be a lawyer to understand that. And of course, a bilateral declaration could not change the text. It can only interpret things which can be interpreted. So if you say, we think that climate change policies are important, it doesn't interpret anything. So it's really not worth it, right? So it usually is only hortatory language without any clear meaning. So I think this is really not a remedy that is should be seriously discussed, at least not from a progressive perspective. The second is a so-called side agreement, or sometimes also called a side letter or a protocol. What is this? This is, depending, of course, on the wording, but typically this would be a legally binding agreement concluded in addition to the trade and association agreement. That could of course change or amend the agreement or address additional topics without opening the negotiating package. So the effects again would be that you would have new legally binding obligations. So the parties, they are sovereign, they can do whatever they want. So they could say, well, we have the agreement as it stands, or the text as it stands. And in addition to that, we have another sort of instrument. But the problem is, of course, you may either run into contradictions or even incoherences, but more likely you will probably only have a very shallow and very limited in scope agreement, right? So even when they talk about side letter or protocol, I think we again need to be aware of the fact that this will probably not bring about any substantial change and will not address any of the substantial problems that we talked about. So then finally, the third option is renegotiations. Now here, of course, the instrument is basically anything changing the content, the language, the scope of existing chapters, amending, replacing, or deleting existing chapters, or even including new chapters. So when you say we renegotiate, you basically say everything comes on the table again. And as I pointed out a minute ago, we are still at a stage where from a legal perspective, that is entirely possible, right? I mean, there's nothing agreed, nothing signed. An agreement in principle means nothing from a legal perspective. So it's very well possible that this could still be done. At least if, you know, from a political perspective, this is what some of us would argue for. The other side could not say this is too late, at least not legally. Now, the effect of course, any topic could be changed, but the danger, and this is maybe something that one would have to sort of also discuss in the political context. Some would say, well, this prolongs the negotiations, and again, it opens the whole package. So one possible compromise, if you wish, could be a political to say, but then let's only renegotiate the trade and sustainable development chapter. And this is also what in the study that I mentioned at the beginning we focused on. So just three sort of possible elements. Firstly, of course, one could include binding obligations, which would aim towards increasing the level of protecting labor, environment, human rights, and climate change policies. I would strongly suggest that it should include corporate responsibility to respect human rights, at least based on the UN guiding principles. You may also know that there are negotiations on a binding treaty in the UN right now, so I think that should be certainly aligned. And then, of course, I think the dispute settlement should be transformed into a binding mechanism. In the study that I mentioned, we have as an annex an alternative text for a trade and sustainable development chapter, not to say this is sort of how it should be, but basically just to demonstrate this is how it could be done. And if people ask, well, what possible changes are there? So that's from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking very much forward to the debate.
Muitíssimo obrigado, professor Krajewski, pelas suas palavras.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your words, for your remarks. I think they open up many questions for debate. You focused on the structure, on the agreement and the chapters of the EU Mercosur agreement. You showed how the focus is on market opening and on the sustainable development, trade and sustainable development. You raised some possible questions, including the negotiation of certain chapters or clauses. I think it's fundamental for the debate for us following your presentation. Okay, now I hand over to my colleague at UFABC, Giorgio Romano, for his comments on the two presentations. So thank you very much, Lucas, Adhemar, Markus. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here in the evening, Professor Markus. You know, it's almost 10 p.m. So I'm going to emphasize a few questions that appeared regarding the political context, because as was mentioned, the DNA of neoliberalism. So in Brazil, there were negotiations. It's a 20-year-old agreement. So Lula government negotiated it, the Dilma government negotiated, but in the way it is now, it is a project that married very well with the Temer government, with that agenda called the Bridge to the Future. This liberal opening actually was about not having a project of developing national industry and technology, right? So reminding ourselves that one of the policies of the Dilma government to strengthen innovation in the auto sector, it was precisely the Europeans that went to the WTO to contest this industrial policy aimed at technological development. Quite a moderate initiative, it must be said. So then, after the Temer government, there was an offensive to unlock some agreements, but did advance. So the fact that the agreement was concluded at the start of the Bolsonaro government has to do with the Bridge to the Future agenda of the Temer government. So it's a huge contradiction now for Bolsonaro, who's always going on about anti-globalism, but signed the agreement because of its grounding in the agribusiness and finance sectors. So also with the help of the Macri government in Argentina that had a similar outlook, which is this indiscriminate opening. This is what Paulo Guedes wanted. So that's at the national level here in Brazil. I think the opposition, the left, the social movements, we had such a big agenda on our hands, so attacks on social security, on labor rights, on social rights in general. So this agreement, we weren't able to mobilize around it like we had been able to mobilize around the FTAA years before. So it ended up becoming a small part of our struggles. So the agreement has to do with the international question, the Chinese question. After 20 years, there's such an enthusiasm on the part of the Europeans. They didn't always have this enthusiasm. I think particularly Germany, the German industrial interests, chemical, auto, capital goods, they're well served by this agreement. And it's clear that they had to face up to the Chinese competition in a more active way. So overcoming the traditional resistance of the French farmers. So there was strong economic elements and trade-related elements, interests. So on both sides. So the finance, the agribusiness in the Latin America and the industrial sector in Europe. So why hasn't it been concluded yet? I think there are three forces in Europe that complicated the agenda. First, the ones that were always against the protectionism of especially France and Ireland. This remains. There's a new opposition, which is the anti-globalist opposition. The new right in Europe is against any free trade agreement for other reason, for whichever reason, and this is present as a broader than specific interests, sectoral interests, but it does have an electoral appeal. And there's a third element, a strong movement of politicization of the environmental question. The green parties are growing all over Europe, Austria, Holland, France, Germany, and these have strong criticism regarding labor and environmental. So these three forces together, joining together, although they are very different, they came together in an opportunistic or pragmatic fashion. And I see that the economic and trade interests will insist on the agreement because there's many business opportunities, but they have to win time. Nobody in Germany is going to talk about this strongly before the elections, for example. The additional protocol that was explained and criticized by Professor Markus is just to win time, to neutralize the resistance in Europe. It's not something to be taken seriously. But after the German elections, there are the French elections. And I think it's very hard for that the liberals will want to put this on the agenda. There's a very small window between these two. After that, there are elections in Brazil. I think the questioning of the European, of the Argentinian government are not enough. But if we have, let's suppose we have a Lula government again, and an allied government in Argentina that wants to build innovation, industrial development in Mercosur, then there is a basis for renegotiation. So the question that is put before all of us who think that Mercosur deserves much more, the peoples of the Mercosur countries deserve much more than the neo-colonial pact that Adhemar used. So let's enter this debate that Professor Markus said. What do we want? Do we want no agreement, like we did against ALCA? Do we want to reform it, renegotiate it, as Professor Markus said? And deep down, what kind of integration do we want? Because elections are next year. It's 200 years of Brazilian independence, political independence. A good moment to reflect. Where do we want to be in the world? What kind of integration do we want? What kind of development do we want for our country? We want a people's democratic project, and it was never about autarky, closing frontiers or anything like that. So this whole debate about Mercosur compels us to face this debate, because we have the themes ready for next year to put forward an alternative. So after the French and German elections, the European Commission, before the Brazilian election, they'll even probably approach the Lula campaign, even during the election season, what they're thinking. So there is nothing that is set in stone. Everything is open still, except now, with there are the whole activities of Rebrip, and so we can take up again how we can contribute to this debate. So Thank you very much for your contributions. I think we have a process ahead that we want to be part of. So I hand back to Lucas.
Thank you, George, for your comments. We have now a round of questions at least. So I want to invite Ricardo, Mariana, Gabriel to ask their questions. And the questions can also be sent on the chat window, okay? And then I can ask them to the professors. Okay? Ricardo, the floor is yours if you want to ask the question. I think we could have like a block of questions, a round. Like individually, we could have like a block of questions so that we don't have a problem with the translation. So Ricardo can ask his questions and then I'll hand it over to Mariana and then I'll hand it over to Gabriel. Good afternoon. My name is Ricardo. I am master's degree candidate in international relations of the university. I want to ask Professor Markus. May I ask in Portuguese? You have translation, right? So the question is, we in Brazil, we are reading about the European Green Deal. We'll read a lot about this, about the impact that this could have on diplomacy, on European diplomacy, by adding principles about a green diplomacy, right? My question is, what's the impact of the European Green Deal with the Mercosur agreement? You know what I mean? Will that increase resistance? So will this force to change the agreement by adding these principles in the future agreement? This is the question. Thank you, Ricardo. Professor Krajewski, did you want to answer now or you want to get more questions?
I leave that up to you. So I can answer now or I can collect, whatever.
Okay, perfect. So we're gonna do 2 more questions. Mariana, por favor.
Mariana, over to you. Good afternoon, everybody. My question is a little bit more focused or on what Adhemar presented, but Professor Markus can also talk to it. I want to know about government procurement. I mean, I understand that this proposal of this being opening market in reciprocity in terms of services, infrastructure, goods. So these markets will be open in, how can I put it, dual conditions for both parties of the agreement. But I want to know, is it really possible? Because we're dealing with the global south countries trying to relate it to the north countries. If you put it all together, what would be the main difficulties for countries in the Mercosur to get these services to countries in the European Union? Thank you, Mariana. Gabriel has a question too. Thank you, Professor Lucas. Thank you, Professor Krajewski. Thank you, Professor Mineiro. My question is, Europe is going through this change to a 4.0 industry, investing in electric car, and this agreement will allow getting investments from Europe, right? Would would it be possible that Brazil could use these changes in Europe to use the agreement somehow so that the transition would happen in Brazil too by internalizing some production that companies want to do here? So clearly they'll have a lower cost, then it could be interesting. I don't know. So this is an opportunity. So I want to know from you if this is not going to happen the way the agreement it is, how can we redo the agreement for this to be possible? Considering that this has to do with environmental issues, because the green car, electric car, and all that, we could tap into this to change in, for the for a low carbon energy mix. Thank you, Gabriel. We have two more questions, but I'm gonna have them asked in the next round. So I'll hand it over to Professor Mineiro and then Professor Krajewski. And then you can answer the question that was asked to you, or you can also answer the other questions. Hand over to Adhemar. Thank you, Lucas. First, Mariana's question about governmental procurement. I mean, the first thing is that the details have been published not long ago, so I don't really know the details yet, uh, so to speak. I think it was late July, so I was on vacation, so I didn't have the time to really go over this. But anyway, I think it is worth taking into consideration the analysis made by the Brazilian government about the agreement. This is available on the government website. This analysis, and this was probably done with also with the Ministry of Economy and the Defense. The way they champion government procurement is curious because they don't even say that we're going to have the possibility of competing in European markets for government procurement. So they don't put emphasis on that. The emphasis is on the more efficient use of public resources. So it is just like by offering our government procurement markets, you can buy services, goods at a cheaper price from European producers, or we can also force Brazilian producers to lower their prices. So it is curious that the Brazilian administration says this. But we know this is complicated. And it's complicated because you have actually, I mean, this should come up in the discussion that we will have in the Congress in Brazil about the agreement. Government procurement is very sensible when it comes to local development. So municipalities, states, they'll take the possibility of using their government procurement as a tool to or for local development. So if there's a lot of supply, a lot of offer, and in the case of Brazil, you're actually changing the rules of the country that say that the subnational levels have autonomy. If they do have autonomy, how can you provide these sectors with a strategy that will not allow for local development. I think this is an important point. As I told you initially, this is not part of the discussion, even though this is part of the agenda of WTO and FTAA. Government procurement was not part of the initial negotiations. It started like in 2004 to try and close the agreement, but now they're strong. They're much stronger. I mean, there are many difficulties for you to enter the European market. There are many restrictions, constraints that start with cultural issues. We saw it. Actually, there are discussions about the transatlantic partnership. There was a lot of resistance from Belgium when it comes to discussing this agreement with the United States in the European Union. They discussed many issues, including cultural issues, because you have to defend the local market, the local culture through governmental procurement. So it's very difficult. I mean, there's also language issues because you have government procurement that will be published in many different languages in different countries. So Brazilian companies won't have access to it. So maybe Paraguay could use a Guarani to try and speak. If not, we have Portuguese and Spanish, but they're European languages that are present in Europe, so we have translation available. But imagine, I don't know, if you are in a competition in Slovenia or Estonia, I mean, or countries that you don't have access because of language. And also there are other barriers like local laws, national laws. So there's a lot of difficulty. So even though they talk about reciprocity, this is not the emphasis for the Brazilian government. So the idea is to open domestic markets and maybe increase economic efficiency, as they say, to buy it cheaper. But they never thought about government procurement as a strategy for development, which is the essence of government procurement discussions. This is the first point. But I promise if Lucas and Giorgio call me again, after I read the details of this chapter, I promise that I can go back to this topic and give you more details about it. Now, Gabriel's question, structural changes, it's not part of the agenda either. This is curious because when you talk to the negotiators, European negotiators, or to representatives from the European Union that defended this agreement, they actually talk about it and they say uh, that there is a situation in the world that's so far. I mean, it is not the one that we had because now China has adopted a position of more environmental protection, environmental commitment, because the traditional European position was that if you don't close the agreement with us, you have to close the agreement with China. But you know that with China, this is complicated when it comes to environment and democracy and all that, right? First of all, for environment, China has changed its position and its commitments to the environment. Number two, on the agenda for what we call the the belt, the new Silk Road, they say that if you want, they have a menu for depending on the commitment you want to have for the Belt and Road Initiative. They have a list of developments that have to do with the 4.0 industry and all that. If it exists for real, we don't know, but it is it is offered. And then there is the commitment of Europeans to environmental issues, as we said. I said this. Professor Markus said that too. Actually, this is subordinate to free trade. It's not about a new development model concerned with environmental issues. It's to the contrary. Free trade, we say like free trade causes some environmental problems, social problems. Let's see how we can treat these side effects. But we see these as side effects. We're not really concerned about the disease. We're trying to treat side effects. So this point that you raised would be important if you open for reviewing the agreement, because the negotiations are from the 1990s. So now in 2020, 2021, 2022, from now on, especially now with all the technological changes that we have after COVID-19, the scenario has changed, not only in the society but also in trade. So we could restart the discussion to have a different development discussion in considering the rights that we have to guarantee and have to see how trade could be combined with this development strategy in this new scenario. It's not the other way around, to start with free trade and then talk about side effects of free trade. I think this is an interesting point, actually. If we could resume negotiations, say the world has changed, it's as the industry 4.0, it's post COVID-19 and all that. But how can, like, building on labor rights, social rights, COVID-19, Industry 4.0, how can we think about integrating not only Mercosur, but also integrating Mercosur with other regions such as EU, that historically speaking, we have a lot of ties, not only in terms of culture, but also economy and thought. So we should actually do this. That's it.
Thank you. Professor Markus, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, three very interesting, very informative, very challenging questions. If I may, I'll take them in the order in which they were asked. So first to Ricardo's question regarding the importance of the European Green Deal on sort of European diplomacy, broadly speaking. Now that's going to be very interesting to watch. I mean, from the perspective that I can see, we can, of course, also see within Europe different forces, and it's very clear that the trade agreement was negotiated within the European Commission by the old trade people, DG Trade as it is called, and of course, and the European Green Deal is not just an environmental policy; it's also an industrial policy, right? So it's really something that is not necessarily counter sort of trade liberalization, but that try to brings sort of this idea of opening markets and at the same time being able to protect the environment. So I think it will have an impact on new negotiations, but I wouldn't be so sure whether it's necessarily going to be a progressive impact. It could be just a sort of a new industrialization impact following the same market opening investment logic that's bad. But it's interesting to see that. Of course, as Giorgio was saying, we have elections in 2 maybe not entirely insignificant European member states. And then, of course, so that we will see what kind of a government we will get in Germany. It could be very well that it's a sort of a liberal government with a green touch. So we'll have to see about that. But it's absolutely right that may have an impact on the negotiations, but it's still unclear what kind of an impact. Now, if I may also come to the government procurement question by Mariana. As Adhemar was saying, 3 weeks ago, the European Commission published the list of commitments, the European ones, and we also have, at least as I could see, we also have the list of commitments by Argentina. I haven't seen the government procurement opening list by Brazil, so maybe you know that, but at least it's not publicized on the EU's webpage. On the EU's webpage, we have the European schedule and the Argentinian schedule. And what's very important here, I think, is even though, as Mariana was saying, there is reciprocity in principle, that does not translate into real reciprocity. So basically the way these, and I'm sure you know this, the way these procurement agreements work is that each side says which entities, which public entities it applies to, and which economic activities. And I just scanned the European side, and at the EU, it's only, for all member states, it's only the highest government level. So in Germany, it's only federal agencies, federal ministries, federal agencies. And you live in a federal state, so I don't need to tell you this, but if you only have government procurement for the federal agencies, the vast chunk of the market is not open, right? And it's the same with all other member states, as far as I can tell. It's just the central entities. So it doesn't open local procurement markets. So it doesn't open building schools, building hospitals, building roads, these sorts of things. Now, interestingly, and this is just a bit interesting, the Argentinian schedule includes the central level, but also all the universities. So I think that's very interesting. And obviously, you will have to study the Brazilian schedule very, very closely to see precisely what's happening there, because that's really when things are where things are happening. And so, as Adhemar was saying, we have to study these schedules in detail to find out how far it actually goes. And I would be very surprised if we have real reciprocity here. I think we just have a little market opening in the European Union and a lot of market opening in the Mercosur countries. And coming lastly to Gabriel's question, again, I'm not an expert in this particular sector. And obviously, I think there are possibilities. I would say one would probably have to ask the question, firstly, how is this related to intellectual property rights? I really don't know, but I mean, if you talk about, the green car and energy mix, these sorts of things, to which extent does this relate to intellectual property? And the second is, of course, technology transfer. I mean, in all these agreements do not really talk about technology transfer, even though they could. So I think this could be a second element to put into a new negotiating agenda. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor Marcos. Muito obrigado, Adhemar, pelas.
Thank you, Adhemar, Marcus, for your replies. We will now go to a second round. We have 2 more questions, if you don't mind, and then we will wrap up our conversation. So Professor Tatiana Berringer from UFABC asks a question to Professor Marcus. So how does the common agricultural policy, how would it, as a security clause for the European Union, how can we think about an agreement that respects European and South American food sovereignty? So the food sovereignty issue in the 2 continents in the context of the agreement. The second question, which is also for both, is we talked a lot about trade and sustainable development chapter, and this is a question that historically has divided developing countries and developed countries. And so I'll take a step back and ask a question to both of you about the way in which you understand the relations between human rights and international trade, with the insertion of human rights rules in trade agreements, with the language of trade agreements that ultimately aim to liberalize trade and will be interpreted by trade specialists in the last resort. So in abstract terms, how do you look upon this connection between trade and human rights within the trade regime? So Adhemar, do you want to kick off? No problem. I don't know if I'll be able to answer, but your question is very complex. Feel free to answer as you wish. For a long time, the negotiators of the Mercosur and Brazil in particular always looked upon human rights and environmental question as this idea of protectionism, that it was a veiled form of protectionism by the other countries. So to alter this vision is a very new process, at least in the case of Mercosur countries and Brazil in particular, because the big fear was always that this could be used as a protectionist measure. So that's the starting point. And ours is the opposite. Our position is exactly the opposite. The organizations of civil society, it's not a state position, it's a position of society. The state position is always to say, we don't want human rights and environment in trade policies. It's not the right place because they could be manipulated for protectionist ends by countries that don't want our exports. So from the point of view of society, I think the major trap was that the interests of major corporations the use of trade agreements that should be subordinated to human rights and others that are the interests of humanity. It ended up being the opposite. So the pressure of the major corporations, the major international lobbies, the major law firms at global level meant that normally the commercial interests prevailed over any and every other interest. Basic human rights clauses, basic social environmental questions. So this put us in a situation where we have to deal with this inversion from the point of view, the conceptual point of view. So first, you determine what you want from the point of view of rights. When you're talking about freer trade, freeing up trade, you're talking about equaling the same market, that structures of production and social structures that are very different. So you take the case of a small African country, or even a large country like India, and some products in Brazil. So the family agriculture, small-scale family agriculture, produce some of these products in an artisanal fashion, like hundreds of years ago. So to expose this production structure with no defense and with no alternative to these farming families, no protection from international trade, this would destroy them. So a small sugar producer sugarcane producer in India you expose it to major Brazilian, for example, Brazilian cane production producers, would mean suicide. There were so many farmers that committed suicide because of the effects of liberalization. Sugar was one case. So it made completely non-viable many crops cultivation in India. So Brazil grew in a period when it was able to combine within its diplomacy this question of connecting and trying to arbitrate between the interests of major commercial export-driven agriculture with the family agriculture interests. So for a period in the Lula government, we saw the integration of the Ministry of Land Reform as part of the delegations, the official delegations, and of the definition of Brazilian foreign trade policy. Is this the best way? No, it's one way that did take place. Just as much as if we don't have a significant change, including from the point of view of subordinating the interests of major corporations, and then there's a whole discussion about corporate capture of major state institutions, international institutions that determine these legislations, these norms, and the prevalence of certain interests. If you don't escape from that corporate capture and subordinate trade negotiations or the WTO to the United Nations or to the ILO or to the climate agreements, well, then the alternative will be that you're going to deal with how these interests will be integrated in trade agreements in such a way that preserves the possibilities from the point of view of social, human, environmental rights. It's not the best way. The best way would be that trade agreements were subordinated to the higher interests of humankind. But of course, we know that in practice, the question is not dealt with in this way. So this question of putting some of these questions inside the trade agreements, if it is to be real, it has to be done seriously, with the seriousness that the question requires, with chapters that are as binding as the other chapters, and even with society's interests prevailing in relation to the smaller interests, which are the interests that we consider to be those of trade liberalization. It's complex, it's a big debate, it's a discussion that implies an important change in the correlation of forces for it to be brought about, but I think it's an essential element that brings forth the issue of corporate power and global institutions. Thank you very much, Adhemar. Professor Markus, your remarks?
Thank you very much. Two, again, very complex questions. I have to admit, I'm not an expert in agricultural policy, but I'll give it a try, because I actually think the two questions can be linked. I mean, to me, the first starting point is that, of course, it is problematic if you sort of subject agricultural productions to trade to start with. But the real problem, at least in the European Union, lies in the structure of the common agricultural policy, which favors large, big agribusiness farms also in Europe. So when Adhemar talked about the small-scale farmers, you know, we have small-scale farmers in Europe too, which are subject to also competition from big farming. So I think the starting point should be that we need to reform the domestic agricultural policy so that also small-scale farming is possible. And then we need to ensure that sort of a reformed agricultural policy is not torpedoed by the trade agreements. And that's, I think, where we can actually link also this question about food security and the question about human rights together, because at the end of the day, I think one can say, of course, food security, the right to food is a human right. And I think that one can bring these things together. And so at the end of the day, I think what we need in a new trade agreement would be sort of a clause which allows governments and local actors enough space to protect, as Adhemar was saying, human rights, human interests of society. And technically that can be done through what I call a broad general exception clause, where you basically not just have very narrow, limited policy goals and link them to everything has to be necessary and not more trade restrictive than necessary. You need a broad exception clause. And then you need to make sure that this exception clause is not interpreted by trade diplomats and trade experts, but it's interpreted by human rights experts, by experts of social policy, by experts of all sorts of things. All that can be done. I mean, it's not, it's not impossible, but one actually has to think creatively of new elements to put into an agreement. But I think at the end of the day, it's very well possible. The ideas are out there, but one really would need to have a fresh start. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Professor Markus.
Thank you, Professor Markus. We have been here for an hour and a half now. I want to say a huge thank you for all those that are watching and who will watch the recorded version later on. But above all, I want to thank Professors Adhemar and Markus, who kindly accepted our invitation. We know people have a lot of remote commitments, so how wonderful that we were able to count on both of you for our discussion here today. So thank you. Thank you also to colleagues and students from the UFABC and the support of FIS Brazil in the holding of this event. So thank you very much, my dear comrades. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Keep in touch.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good evening.
Great
Bye-bye.
contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Markus. Have a good rest now.
pleasure.
Abraço a todos.
Thank you. Bye.
Obrigado, Adhemar.
Bye bye.
Abração.
Obrigado.
Obrigado
Até mais,
todo mundo.
Adhemar.
Falou, Lucas.
Até mais,
Obrigado,
Gonçalo.
time intérpretes
Thank
também.
you, interpreters as well. Thank you very much.
Tchau, tchau, gente. Valeu. Muito bom, Fernando.